Hi, my name is Mikhael Manekin. I'm an activist in Jerusalem, and this is 18 Questions, 40 Israeli Thinkers from 1840.
So we'll begin where we always do. As an Israeli and as a Jew, how are you feeling at this moment in Israeli history?
Confused. I don't know, words like history are very big. I would probably say sort of like emotionally, politically confused is probably the dominant feeling.
What do you mean by that?
I think there's a lot of questions which have to do with Israel. That I focus on, and a lot of questions which have to do with Judaism and with ethics and all sorts of issues of that nature. But there's also just a general confusion about the world and about politics in the world. Activists, we tend to be, think about life many times simplistically. We'll get involved in something and then something will change, which is obviously silly. But it's part of your ethos, and it's part of the way you construct your day to day, and it's very hard to do that in the current moment in the world. So just thinking about who you are, how do you do things, and even before we talk about Israel specifically, I think raises a lot of questions. So it's not just saying, well, what are the next elections going to be like? What do I think about Bibi? What do I think about the religious right? It's actually asking questions like, who am I as a political player or as somebody who wants to influence things in the current environment? So I'd say that's the primary sort of sense or feel with everything that has to do with my sort of emotional political life. Also, it's really, there's this duality where on one hand, the sort of larger situation in Israel for me, and I think for a lot of people, it's just very frightening, saddening, depressing. But on the other hand, I also have like Baruch Hashem, like a really enjoyable life here. My kids are happy living here. I'm really happy that this is where we are. So there's also that weird dissonance of like the political and the personal, which you try to reconcile with. I guess that's an added dimension of that general confusion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess now's the part where we kind of segue into Israel. What has been Israel's greatest success and greatest mistake in the war against Hamas?
I think Israel needs to be defined. When we say Israel, what do we mean? That's a bit of a cop out to what I'm going to say. To what I'm going to say. I think so many elements of Israeli society has behaved so impressively over the last 2 years. And here it is important for me to say I'm a very political person, and I come from this isn't so. Sort of before I say the next sentence, this isn't just about politics, meaning people from left, right, and center. I think there's such a strength and beauty in the solidarity of Israeli society, which I get really moved by. I don't know if it's unique to Israelis or Jews, and in that sense, I don't really care about that. But there's a real feeling of camaraderie and solidarity, and people trying to figure out how to do the right thing, not only for them, but for the people around them. It makes me very proud to be where I am. So I would say I think, been the greatest success. For me, the greatest failure or challenge has been how to deal with with weakness, or with people who are weak, or with people who don't have, and that could be the hostages and the moving of them to the side. It could also be the inability to talk about the suffering of those who are attributed to the enemy, meaning Palestinians. How do we talk about those who are in pain and in suffering and need our assistance, or need our care, or need our attention? And again, that's a sweeping statement, and maybe that focuses on only a specific type of Israel. But I think the looking at morality or ethics as a luxury, or as something that we can't, or as a weakness, is something which has been really troubling to me. And that makes it even more complicated considering the first thing I said.
Yeah, so I was going to ask. It's interesting that you note that you say solidarity
Yeah.
is the point of the greatest success against the war, and then also have such strong criticisms of the war and of Israel's military
Yeah.
campaign in specific, especially given the fact that from the beginning of the war and I'd say through May,
Yeah.
probably maybe a little bit before, a little bit afterward, the sense of Israeli society standing behind the war, standing behind what has the military campaign that had already been done in Gaza
Right.
was very, very strong. So do you see that military, but you still see that solidarity as a success, even given your critiques of the war?
Yeah, to some extent, yeah. It's something which is really. I'm very much against the war, definitely now. So I'll I'll
Were you not
emphasize
in the
that.
beginning?
No, I think for the first, I think I was. I mean, I think there were a lot of questions, but clearly after the 7th of October, and even if there was, a 6th of October that I was frustrated with, the country can't allow itself to behave the way to behave in a passive way or a pacifist way post the 7th of October. And there are things which could have been done differently, and maybe I'll talk about that in a second. But I think up until the first lull, like there was a space, I think it was in December when we returned the first hostages, where I felt question is, and January after that, the question was open to where things are going. And I think at a certain point, then I would have worded it then. I probably wouldn't have said this now, but like worded it then, I said, I'm for a war, but not this war. Meaning there was a sense that fighting should continue, but the goals increasingly made less sense to me, and it was increasingly less clear where things are going. In hindsight, a year later, I maybe, and I'm not saying this from a military or tactical perspective, but from a national perspective, I think if there was a wait a day or two or a week before going straight in, it could have changed very much the way the war happened. Ironically, I started thinking that after the Iran attacks, because Iran, once we attacked them, they took a while till they responded, and that made me think about how we behaved post the 7th. That there's something about saying we're definitely responding, but something happened and we need to stop, maybe mourn, maybe think, and then respond. And obviously, that's more complicated than that, hostages and soldiers and so on. But I don't know in hindsight. In the more general attitude, I think probably since January, February of 2004, I didn't understand as an Israeli where things are going, where is this headed, and also what is the toll that the other side is paying, what is the toll that we're paying, what is it saying about who we are. I think questions increased. Regarding the solidarity question, I mean, that's why I said confused or complicated. People think that if you say, definitely today, people think, definitely in the U.S., people if you say something is complicated, it means you don't really have an opinion about it, or that you don't have. I'm very much against this war, and my feelings here in this world are complicated, and I think that makes sense. The closer you are to something, the more complicated it becomes. I've friends who have been killed in this war, increasingly as soldiers, increasingly children of friends. So my relationship to them is very much part of who I am. So it's a war is a very, very, violence is a very complicated thing, and war is a very complicated thing. I think it's okay to say I'm against something and also recognize the complexity of it.
How have your religious views changed since October 7th?
It's always a hard question to answer in general, like how views change, let alone religious views. I feel, and now I'm saying this sort of in missing something because maybe time has passed and I've sort of reverted to my usual self. But I feel that I davened much more post the 7th of October, a lot more reading of sort of more ancient like Jewish texts, Middle Ages, definitely. I think
Any in particular that you're thinking of?
I think we do sadness very well in our tradition. Um, when the day after the war started, one of the folks in the Smol Haemuni said
The faithful
the
or
faithful
religious
left.
left.
We decided to start doing a shir once every a day for 20 minutes and people different from the community on Zoom. Then we gave a mishaberach for everybody we needed to give a mishaberach for. Just a lot of people. And I heard we had in one of our classes somebody named Yuda Mirsky, a rabbi doctor Yuda Mirsky, gave a shir on there's a midrash on God crying, and how God is the only one who knows how to cry all of the time. You have stories about um, I think it's Yirmiyahu who's able to cry during the day, or that people of Israel are able to cry during the night, but only God is able to cry 24 hours straight. And I think that ability to access sort of sadness and recognizing sadness as something which you actually want to connect with and not uh, want to segregate is something which was very powerful for me. I'd say there's probably one. Um, on a very different level, uh, like the 7th of October, this is going to be a bit esoteric. Found me reading Share Ora. It's a book by Jikatelia. It's the 10th sphere. It's like pre-Kabbalah. I don't know how anybody would want to call it. I don't want to get in trouble with academics. It's a very good book if you want to start learning Kabbalah. And there's a lot of sections there about war or what happens in the heavens when people fight. And they were very powerful for me to recognize Jewish content and sort of our ability of thinking that we're right and they're wrong is so powerful in any war and so prevalent in this war as well. And thinking about how do we access sort of our side in the heavenly sphere or in the ethical, for me, it's the ethical sphere as well, has been very sort of
Meaning that there's like a
important for me.
spiritual parallel in some sense when
Yeah.
there's a war happening here.
Yeah, what people in the East or West would call karma, that there's a relationship, or what we call like vayayim shema, like what we call what the expectation of God from us, and definitely the expectation from God from us on this land, is a lot of the things that I've been thinking about over the last year.
So I'm also curious. October 7th, I mean, we kind of alluded to this before, was a rupture in many ways from what Israelis or the world was expecting or thought of in the terms of the conflict of the Israelis and the Palestinians, and especially for many on Israel's left. I know that you've spoken before about how, I mean, you're part of Smol Haemuni, leader of Smol Haemuni, the faithful left, kind of like the invert of the Gush Haemunim, which is more of the right wing part of Israeli society that's religiously motivated or religiously oriented. Did you find your theology in terms of how you think about Israel and how you think about the conflict and the future of the state changing from October 7th in ways that were, because I could imagine and I would understand, and I think many have spoken about this, how October 7th for them was a turning point in inverting or subverting a lot of their own expectations or thoughts about this region?
Yeah, I think there were some things that actually I remember very vividly giving lectures the half a year before the 7th of October, saying very pessimistically and darkly what we view as nonviolence is violence. And at some point, this violence is going to be turned against us, meaning there's going to be a tremendous amount of Palestinian violence against us. This is what I've
What were you referring to when you said what we view as nonviolence?
We Israelis, meaning we Israelis think that the situation now is fine and there's no violence happening.
This situation being in 2022.
In West Bank and Gaza.
Okay.
We view that as a non-violent situation, but there's actually quite a bit of violence happening all of the time. And it's foolish to expect that violence won't be in the most physical level, like of physics. Like at some point, sort of, it'll be tipped against us. And what I would follow that by saying is, I think there's something a bit unnatural, even of the left position, which is trying to solve this problem by advocating for nonviolence and advocating for peace, but in a very pessimistic way. And I'm not an optimistic person in general, but in a very pessimistic way. At one point, this violence will be against us. Now, I, in a way, thankfully, didn't know to expect the type of violence as it appeared on the 7th of October. I say thankfully because in my darkest nightmares, I can't still imagine the sadistic and visceral elements of the 7th of October, and I'm still trying very hard not to watch a lot of the videos, and so I didn't know to imagine that, but I think for a subset of the left, and a lot of the left is not necessarily engaged in actually being in the territories, but for people who are there quite often, it was clear to me that we're amidst a very violent situation, and that violence can be it can be turned against us. So in that sense, I don't think I was something changed in me, meaning there wasn't a rupture that I said, oh, I thought everything was fine, and suddenly there was this violent approach. And I think that's more something that happened in what we would call in Israel the center. And then the left, who really saw this as a non-problem or as a problem that can be solved.
Meaning the left saw that fact that the violence, you're saying that violence was present in
Yeah.
Israelis and Palestinians, and the left was using nonviolence to try and address that, but meaning nonviolence wouldn't work, they needed to use.
No, I'm not saying they needed. I'm saying
only
I still have a fantasy that this place can get better in order to get better, and doesn't need to get worse to get better. I still have
But if it doesn't get better, then violence inevitably will. Kind of like as you were saying in that so to speak, laws of physics, that violence begets violence.
Now, I'm not saying that to, God forbid, justify violence. And there's obviously there's always agency and responsibility, in the sense that the fact that the situation is as is doesn't mean that every individual doesn't have the will to behave the way they think they should behave. But I'm saying, in terms of how I explain to myself the situation, it's not like I was. I said, I didn't think this violence could happen. The type of violence, and so and now I said about things that didn't change, but it is important for me to say, articulate things. The type of violence that we experienced on the 7th of October did and still shakes me, in the sense of recognizing and trying to reconcile with brutality in the region. And what does that mean for somebody who wants to live here in a situation of a positive relationship with other people living here? So for somebody like me, who thinks that it not only is it the most natural, but the most just and the most desirable outcome of the relationship between Jews and Arabs in this land, is that Jews and Arabs in this land will live here together, recognizing the deepest and darkest sort of violences, and seeing them and having them as part of our history, our recent history, doesn't challenge that notion, but it complicates it, if that makes sense. I don't know how something moves from A to B in the way that maybe I did in the past. And lastly, I think the thing that changed for me most in the 7th of October is I thought my state can protect me. And it didn't, and there was no state, on the 7th of October, on every level. There was just nobody there, and that's not. I'm not saying that only to the government. I'm saying that at the military, at the way the structures in our society handled themselves. So, civil society or society at large stepped up, and I talked about in the beginning. But there's this real fear, definitely, when you have children in this country, and have children who are who will get drafted into this country, some sooner than others. That notion that there is no that feeling, that memory, that there's no state when you need it, and that's something that it's important for me to constantly remind myself. The 7th of October could have happened very, very differently if we had a better protection. Meaning, if we had better defense, or even minimal defense, or an understanding. I think this is something that you hear from the right a lot, and I think they have, sometimes they say it to divert attention from government, but that doesn't mean it's not true. Uh, this was a complete failure of the Israeli military, and that's something very hard for a citizen to say, in the most basic sense. So those are things that have changed for me, that are still very much part of my life.
And so I want to shift a little bit to
Sure.
speaking more about Israeli society more generally. What do you look for in deciding which Knesset party to vote for? On
Um,
that same note,
yeah, I would say that I look less for parties and more for people. Um, the American sort of political system is really, really confusing for me to understand. Like, it's so much more complicated, I feel, than the Israeli system. The Israeli system is, I think, pretty easy in that you have sort of sections which are you're supposed to identify, or sort of like parties or sections that you're supposed to identify with most demographically and politically, and the intersection between them. And then but for me, within those parties, I always look for, so I'll have some sort of general assumption of sort of where I am. But then I'll look for people who maybe represent me most, or who I think are most effective or efficient. I say that also because I recognize that as a religious Orthodox lefty, I think it's a bit there's a bit of hubris to imagine that there'll be a party that recognizes my that reflects my demography and sociology and politics, and I should be happy that at least one out of the 120 are with me. And in a way, in an optimistic way, when I think about people and out at parties, there are actually quite a bit of people in different parties who I think I'm really, really happy that they're there. But I would say probably that would be the main thing, is identifying people who reflect my politics, who I really want to bank on. That's a very, saying this out loud, I recognize what an oppositional way of thinking about politics that is. I'm not thinking about ruling. I'm thinking about government. I'm thinking about whatever, like an individual representation. But that's probably my optimistic view of Israeli politics.
which is more important for Israel, Judaism or democracy?
um, I I think probably Judaism, and it's probably true for all sectors of Israeli society, including the left. Um, yeah, there's when one says democracy, that can mean a lot of different things. Of course, Jewry, but also democracy. I think the identity of this country. First, the question of Jews living in Eretz Kodesh in Israel is first and foremost a theological question. Also for secular Zionists, like the question of your relationship with the land and the relationship with power and the relation of sovereignty. And I think it still is. It definitely is post the 7th of October even more. And I think democracy, when it's viewed here seriously, it's usually viewed as a structure of an organization and less of something which is deeply embedded into the psyche of the collective. And I don't say that negatively. I just think you know, that's the way it is. It's definitely more important to me, to be that clear. That Judaism, Jewish tradition, all
What
that's
do you
much.
mean when you say that the Judaism? When I ask that question, how do you understand the Judaism and the democracy?
Yeah. So yeah, in a way, I would probably the what I did in my head was I said, okay, let's think about this as identity first, like collective identity, collective identity. Who are we here as people? I would say is primarily a Jewish question for most Israelis, and to be fair, also in terms of even the structure of the country. I think when I think of democracy, I think about it in its sort of modern liberal democratic sense, and I think there's not really a necessarily a strong liberal democratic backbone of this country. There never was. It has a lot to do with the socialist and social democratic roots of this country. It's not only about religious people. It has a lot to do actually with the people who built this country, who are I don't think really sort of strong liberal Democrats. They were Eastern Bloc social democrats, unionist social democrats. That's the backbone of this country. So liberal democracy, I don't think was ever really a strong feature of this country, and I don't think it was in the '90s. I don't think it is now. I think if you want to find like true liberal democratic sentiment in this country, it's usually among sort of the Arab minority, and then it's considered super radical. But really, what it is moderate liberal democratic and other means. Again, I'm saying this not yet as with an opinion, but just sort of a reflection. Um, so when you said democratic, I thought about liberal democratic identity, and I don't think that's a very strong feature of Israeli politics, including the Israeli left. I don't think it's a strong feature. I
So
don't know,
meaning,
probably leftists wouldn't agree
so
with
to,
me.
just to
But
clarify your answer a bit, because this may
sure,
actually give me more insight.
okay,
You were answering a question not about what you think should be more important, but what
yeah,
you think is more important in reality.
yes,
Okay, fine. Because I was a bit thrown off by your answer. I was like, this is so interesting to come from someone who identifies as a lefty.
yeah.
Which now, and let me
Well, now I'll
rephrase
say
it a
my
moment.
opinion.
Yeah, I'm curious which you think should take priority, which should be more important.
No, well, in terms of my personal behavior of how the country should behave,
Yeah, meaning you were I guess you were giving a descriptive answer. I'm looking for a
yes,
prescriptive answer
thank you.
now.
Well, the prescriptive answer is I would say that I would want the state as a state to behave democratically. I would like to hope that for Jews, that's not enough on a lot of different levels. Um, I've been thinking a lot recently in the last couple of months that um, when Judaism plays a role in the question of democracy and Jewry, it's usually to allow things that democracy doesn't allow. So democracy gives you a certain set of rules, but we're also Jewish, so we need to do a bit less. It's never the opposite. It's never democracy allows us to do all sorts of things, but Jewry forbids us. And that means that Jewry, in the context of sort of the Jewish and democratic, Jewish becomes what allows you to be less than democratic. In our context, it means it allows you to do things to Arabs that democracy doesn't. If we want to be more sort of blunt about it, I would like to hope, at least in terms of my Jewish upbringing and my tradition of my understanding of Jewish tradition, as a Jewry, a lot of times doesn't allow you to do things that, let's say, international law should allow you to do or can allow you to do. So the question is really, one needs to articulate what is Jewish in order to understand the question of Jewish and democratic. I'm not. Maybe another answer would be currently the world is organized in nation states, and in that sense, Jews have the right to have a nation state like everybody else. But it's very, I think, should be very apparent or obvious that if the Mashiach doesn't come tomorrow, then or in the next 100 years, and in 150 years, communities will organize themselves differently. So the question of sort of like the inherent value of the state is uninteresting for me. I'd like it to
Meaning, like a
behave.
nation state is what is the concept of how statehood exists today, but you're
Yeah,
saying it
but
could be a
maybe
different model in 100 years.
yeah,
That's the norm.
yeah, and 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 in that norm, I'd also want Jewry to supply something different, which is sort of our covenant of with God and how we should behave as individuals and communities in this world, and the state should behave by norms of states. I'm also not very good at like sort of like big answers. Like I want our relationship in Israel with Arabs to be different than it is now. I don't have any sort of deep I don't think I have any deep thinking about how the world should organize itself, nor a very sort of like deep interest in how the world should conduct itself. The question that interests me, and this is also the last answer I think to the Jewish and Democratic. The question that interests me is like Jewish behavior and Jewish behavior of me, of my family, of my community. That's the question that interests me. I don't have some sort of like chiddush as to how the world should behave or what is the right way for communities to organize themselves.
So I guess on the note of Israel's identity, now that Israel already exists, what's the purpose of Zionism? In your view, not necessarily in a descriptive view.
um, I think for me, it's a lot of things. First of all, for me, Zionism is a recognition of and thankfulness and critique, but also thankfulness. The critique is easy. The thankfulness is important. This place provides me with a lot of meaning for my life. Um, I love my children in Hebrew. That is not that is a Zionist um, result of that is a Zionist project of speaking Hebrew. We always talk about the state elements, but the fact that I conduct myself in like Lashon HaKodesh is a success of secular Zionists, which I think we religious people need to be thankful for. The fact that I can live in Israel um, um, happily is I should be thankful for. It's a recognition of that part of history which affects my identity. It's part of the cultural element which also very much excites me on an emotional level. So that's answer one. Answer two is that Zionism allows for Judaism to be something different. Um, I if there wasn't like people, you speak with like Jewish post Zionists or things like that, and they say, well, we need to get rid of this. Israel doesn't need this anymore. The state's built, but but it's still called the second name of like Yaakov Avinu. It's still there's so much. There's no neutral identity to this country. It's a deeply Jewish or a type of articulation of Jewry, and I'd rather have that word be Zionism than be the greater Jewish word because it allows my Judaism to be sometimes different and independent from Zionism, if that makes sense. I'm happy with that differentiation because it allows nationalism to not seep into everything in my life.
Do you see Zionism as inherently tied to Judaism?
Well, the way I articulate for myself, I'm aware that there are many non-Jew, like evangelicals, and that who are not. But to the extent that I understand their Zionism, it's one that I'm opposed to. And for me, when I was once at a conference with it was an Arab leader speaking, and then somebody raised their hand, a Jew, raised their hand in Israel, and she said, "It's first important for me to say that I'm not a Zionist." In a way, to sort of like approach him, sort of amicably, and he immediately answered, "What do you mean you're not a Zionist? You're still here." And I really identified with that answer. There's also a for me, Zionism is, and also in the way I articulated it up until now, is a lived experience. It's it's every act that I do in this country is part of a Zionist sort of like thing in the world. Definitely, so long as we're still in conflict with the Palestinians. Like I think that nature of Jewish nationalism, Zionism, has been heightened because we're at war with our surroundings or we're in non-peace. So that people don't really talk about Zionist economy or Zionist culture, but it makes sense that people talk about Zionists in the context of war. And the fact that I think that war should end doesn't mean that I'm not part of it. I also don't think that if I say something, it doesn't stop me from being that thing. Like I feel that that's a cop out to say I'm not part of that. Like I'm part of my community. My community is a Zionist community. I should be thankful for what I'm thankful and try to take it in the way that I think is better for all of us.
So, given your perspectives on the Israeli government and Israel's relationship to the Palestinians, have you ever considered leaving Israel?
Um,
From a standpoint of culpability, meaning if you have a certain perspective that Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, conduct of the war, and a host of other issues are inherently problematic, war
yeah, where
crimes.
would I go? I
Well,
would just
I
be
mean,
culpable of something else. Like I don't, no, I mean, I have, I think there have been very few Israelis, I imagine, who haven't had the conversation about this. Is this really like you're worried about your kids? You're thinking maybe this isn't the easiest place or the hardest place. There's an economic question. It's a bit rough recently, and you can say, the U.S., which would be my immediate, is not so much better. But that's also honestly, that's not necessarily the case. Like U.S. is big enough that you can hide in a bigger bubble than you can here. But in terms of culpability or responsibility, no, lahefech. I mean, this is like, first of all, it's
Meaning, I only ask culpability question because
yeah.
from what you were saying before, it seems like your perspective is that by being a citizen of Israel and someone who lives in Israel, everything you do is inherently supporting
Yeah,
Zionism
no,
and
not
supporting
supporting,
Israel.
part of. And part of means in a way maybe inherently supporting, or at least, but there are other forms, of resisting other than disengaging. And I think like disengagement politically has become very sort of in a lot of sort of sectors of like sort of, I point to myself when I say left, but like in the left, you say like not in my name, not in my name. Like that's a very limited form of engagement, is saying this isn't me. And my engagement is different. And so this is where my people are, and this is my I want to, before I say this is my fight, I want to say this is my community and this is my fight, and my responsibility is to my community, and my community is here. Like it's so I, on the political level, I've never felt, and definitely, and not in the last year, like this society here is lost. Like that's not something that's crossed my mind in sort of the like deep political sense. I can be very angry, it's like a lot of people, and frustrated, but I can also try to understand them, and also recognize that everybody's in the world has like different sorrows. Like it's not, these are mine.
Is opposing Zionism inherently anti-Semitic?
I don't think so. There's the reason I feel sort of confused about this conversation is you need to categorize so many words to even have it, that sometimes I just think this is a waste of time, because you need to categorize what Zionism means, but also what non-Zionism or anti-Zionism and then anti-Semitism. These words mean already so many different things to so many different people. I would say that I mean, even for me, I imagine a lot of people in Israel hearing what I said now would say that's not a Zionist position, and then they would, or that's an even anti-Zionist position, and then what does that mean about my sort
Do you
of like,
consider yourself a Zionist?
yeah, yeah, but I've also learned that that's a question you need to answer really quickly, because even if you stutter for a bit, people don't believe you. But that's what makes this conversation, I think, in a way, I don't know if uninteresting, but like sort of like I don't know what to do with it.
Hmm.
I think,
Meaning the question I think is particularly interesting because it also kind of gets at to a little bit of a complexity between leftism in Israel and leftism in America. Meaning, in the 1840 podcast, there
yeah,
are other channels, so everyone can go and can watch that if they'd like. Joshua
yeah,
Leifer and
sure,
Trinity
of
Or.
course,
So they were speaking about the difference they find in terms of dealing with American leftists and Israeli leftists on the subject of Israel.
right,
And so I think that already there's a ton of nuance between what you've said and what a leftist and as America would say, who may not even qualify as a leftist based on your own positions and
yeah.
your lifestyle and so on. So I'm curious how you view that perspective given that unique like
Well, I
crossroad you're at.
definitely find and then it becomes even more complicated, because what does it mean when you say American leftists? There are so many different types, and I want to make sure I'm not generalizing this community or that community. I don't want to get in trouble with anybody. I find that it's much more. It's easier for me to enter that conversation saying what I'd like for this region, rather than articulating what kind of ism that is, because that makes it easier to have a conversation, recognizing that Zionism means different things for different communities around the world, same as anti-Semitism. Again, it means different things for, nobody thinks that Gur Hasidim are anti-Semitic, and everybody is aware that they're anti-Zionist, and you don't hear that. So obviously it's a complicated conversation, which has to do with a lot of other elements other than what kind of Zionism you have, what kind of Zionism you don't have. I would say that my position regarding Israel Palestine is that this is a land of two peoples. And I don't view that as a problem, but rather as something that we should strive to see, to build relationship of both nations, which will allow for dignity of both. That is and that includes everything, including egalitarianism and full dignity, meaning I don't want any Palestinian in this region to have any less than for me. And I think our test as Jews in this setting is to strive for that not as compromise, but as an ideal. It's not and it's not that I wish it was only us, but since they're also Arabs, let's compromise and have two states. No, I think we're judged in this land by Hashem of creating an ideal of dignity to those who are not part of our community. And for me, that can be, I can explain to you following why that's a Zionist position, and I can also, I imagine, explain to you why that's a non-Zionist position, which I understand. That's what makes the conversation, I think, limited. And that's why I'd rather say what I want. I want to live here happily, and I want Palestinians to live here exactly like I live here, including everything, not including just, including their rights and their birthrights and everything like that. Shmuel Hugo Bergman, who's a really important, I think, figure in the past of this country. He built, the National Library and a lot of other things, but he was also a writer. And he has this famous, and he was part of Brit Shalom, and he has a beautiful line which says, Chesed asa Hashem le'amo shenatan et moladato l'shnei amim, which is that God graced his people by giving them his land for two peoples. And I really identify with that sentiment, also post 7th of October, that I think our aspiration is to be able to share this place between people who are outside of our community, outside of our Jewry. I would say that's my position. I can very much articulate that as a Zionist position if you wish, and if you really want, I can explain to you why that's anti-Zionist.
No, that's good. That's good.
Okay.
Is the IDF the world's most moral army?
Well, only if you tell me who's second place. No, I don't think so. But I don't know what that means. It sounds to me that, people have been saying that for years and years. I think the assumption is that anybody given our situation would behave worse. I don't know if that's the case, nor is that of any interest to me. I think from an international law perspective, we should be upholding international law. From a Jewish perspective, we should be behaving like what is expected and required from us. I am very, very, very nervous, worried about what we're doing, both in the West Bank and Gaza. Not as a new phenomenon. I've been worried about this for years, and I've been very sort of vocal and sort of organized around this issue, but increasingly so in the last year and a half. I don't think you need me to say that that our rules of engagement have changed over the last year and a half. There's ample evidence. It's something which is very frightening for me. Not because somebody else would have done it better, but because I think we're unnecessarily hurting and killing. And unnecessarily means that we're callous, and I'm trying to be on one hand exact, but on one hand, I think we're callous with the lives of Arabs for a variety of different reasons. Some of them more legitimate, like fear or worry about our own. Some of them natural but illegitimate, like vengeful and angry. And some of them just downright wrong in terms of changing of rules of war for a lot of different political and national calculations. But for me, it doesn't matter. If we look callously at how we hurt others, then that is something that's a Jew can explain why that's problematic from a Jewish perspective, and a secular humanist could explain it. But for me, it's wrong. And I don't think I think we've become more upfront about our disregard. We in sort of the national sphere, like my community, Israeli Jews, have become more easy with the pain of others. And we can give excuses to ourselves or to others all we want, but I think it's a very, very sad reality of who we are. And I think it's going to take a very long time to both recognize that and also to do tshuva on that as individuals in the community and to rectify what we're doing. And it's angering for me and it's frightening for me. So Dafka there, it's important for me to not sort of like beat around the bush. I think, yeah. It doesn't matter the first place, second place, third. Like I think we're objectively, not objectively, or we're behaving in a way which we shouldn't behave.
Should all Israelis serve in the army?
As a leftist, I think so. I'm really for universal conscription.
You think it sarcastically or?
No, I'm serious.
Oh.
But that includes everybody. No, I think the only way to be responsible is to partake. And then there's obviously a choice of objection, and that should be recognized to a degree. But if for example, Haredim or Arabs, for that matter, in a real universal conscription, so Arabs are drafted as well, and they're very right to refuse if they want to and pay the civic consequence for that. But I think that creates a sense of responsibility which doesn't exist now. So when we allow full communities not to serve, we're basically saying we're not allowing them to partake responsibly in the community, and there we also don't hear their voices. A lot of what's happened in the past of this country had to do with soldiers coming out from left and from right, had to do with soldiers saying we refuse to do this. So on the left you had that in service or talk about, or we don't want this to happen. So in the left, you had that in the Second Intifada and after the first Lebanese War, and you had and after the disengagement and during the disengagement, you had that on the right as well, and an evacuation of settlements. And I think that's really important because it creates a relationship between state and soldier. So yes, I think everybody should be required to serve, and I hope a lot of people refuse when it undermines their own values. It's a good Republican answer.
Should Israel be a religious state?
No. I'd like a lot of people here to be religious, but I don't think states are religious. I don't think not all things that Jews do should be like religious by virtue of Jews.
What do you mean by that?
If you eat a sandwich, it doesn't become like a Jewish sandwich. But you have to say like a bracha. And I think if you have a state, it doesn't necessarily become like a religious state, but you have to behave a certain way in it. And in that sense, I think states are. I don't know what a religious state would be, but I think it would require not only praxis but a deep belief in a lot of different things. And I don't think that's ever been on the table, except if you read Rav Yitzchak Breuer in the 40s. But I think the reason why even people like that, he was one of the founders of Aguda and an important and interesting and sometimes forgotten thinker.
Why? What's making you think of him now?
Because he wrote a whole thesis about what a religious state should look like. Mm-hmm. But a lot of that has to do with belief in Hashem. It's not just about places being closed on Shabbat and no civic marriage. It has to do with a deep, I don't see the use in that, and nor do I don't even understand what that would mean, like a religious state in that sense. And I think there's so much to do up in that it seems to me, not. I don't why that would be sort of the main. I don't think any Jew lives in Israel. It's this place. There's no. I don't have enough ability to be Jewish here. I wish there was more ways for me to be Jewish here. I do think we should be thinking more about how do we behave as Jews in a state than we do. So the question is, I think, shouldn't be only about, or even primarily about the borders of the community, but should be about the individuals in the community. What does it mean for me to be a Jew in a state where I am a citizen? I think is a really important question, which isn't asked enough. Because we constantly ask about the Jewry of the state and not about the Jewry of the individual in the state.
Yeah, good.
Okay.
Yeah. If you were making the case for Israel, where would you begin?
I would begin in the fact that it's a 21st century and it exists as a state. And I find there's something very conservative, or even not even conservative. It's something sort of very historic about having a conversation, like a constant conversation, as if we're in the 30s, and we don't know yet whether Israel should exist or not. Israel is a state.
What do you mean we?
We Israelis, Israel exists, has existed for a very long time,
I
and
mean,
it
that's usually not an Israeli conversation, though. Usually it's a conversation citing, I think, some of the same objections that you have towards Israel's
yeah.
conduct and military campaigns and so on. And then it then brings up the question of, has this state lost its right, so to speak, to function as a state?
Yeah, I don't. I don't think states have rights to lose in that sense, and so it doesn't. And even before we ask about the practicality of what that means, both in terms of what would happen with all the people here, and also where would they go, and all these questions, which I think are many times asked, the assumption that states are these moral actors and that they forfeit rights if they behave in a certain way. If a state behaves, or governments in a state behave immorally, then they should stop. They should be tried if needed, and there needs to be created another system where that behavior isn't happening immorally. And that I can fully stand behind. But the idea of losing some sort of prior right based on moral conduct is confusing for me. I think, and seems to me sort of detached from the political. So in a sense, because I believe less or am more pessimistic about sort of this moral sort of argument, I don't understand sort of the negation of it. I personally, as Mikhael, think nation states are not, like, one day we'll look back in history and we'll say that was not really the best way to control the world in like different nation states. But this is what we're doing now. And then we need to make sure that it happens properly and healthily. As somebody not looking at this from the outside, from within, I'd really like the place that I live in even live at a higher standard. But I don't think that's relevant from a world perspective. That's relevant from a personal perspective. I just don't understand the argument which says uh, uh, if a government behaves immorally, then that some sort of creates a notion going backwards. I do understand the argument saying that there are endemic flaws or flaws in this place way before 67, and I agree with that. And I think there are issues in 48 which need to be discussed. There are challenges not only in this country but have to do with refugees, which need to be discussed. They need to be reprimanded. We need to not reprimand. They need to be fixed, and that requires Israel to do things which are fundamentally and radically different from the way we think. But that I don't think that has to do with our. I don't want. I don't think that should happen by forfeiting forfeiting rights.
Can questioning the actions of Israel's government and army, even in the context of this war, be a valid form of love and patriotism? Which is probably a silly question to ask you, but I'll ask it
I hope
nonetheless.
so. I think I think good tochacha, like that's
Like in your criticism, do you view that as? I mean, you kind of alluded to this before, but do you view that as a form of patriotism to the state?
I don't know if my instinctive word would be patriotism, but it would definitely be love for my people. Like I definitely.
What draws you to the word love and repels you from the word patriotism?
It's patriotism is just not part of my. It's not part of my natural vocabulary. It's not. I. I'm fine to be called a patriot, but it's. I don't think. But like I think like Avat Israel is much more part of sort of my like love of Israel is much more part of sort of the language that uh, I'd like to be connected to, and definitely part of loving Israel from within is tochacha or judgment, or I don't know what the right translation for tochacha is, but it's definitely part of that. I think it's very the ear very much knows how to identify sort of love from within and reprimand from without. So I don't think it necessarily needs to be sort of constantly judged from without. Um, but um, but yeah, I mean, I've spent most of sort of my adult career in sort of critiquing this place, and I'd like to hope that it's from a deep love of this place, or at least a sense of responsibility and commitment and being part of, and also like deep interest, like self interest. At the end of the day, again, this is my literal home. This is my literal living room. And it's where my kids grow up, and hopefully this area is where they'll raise their children. And part of that is being in conversation with general community.
What do you think is the most legitimate criticism leveled against Israel today?
I don't know. Okay, I'm probably going to be. I'm probably going to regret saying this. I think that the on the other uh, uh, the easy answer for me would be that Israel is not conducting rules of war properly, and that which I think is true, and that we're killing innocents more than we should, which I also think is true. But I would say a more challenging argument being leveled at Israel is that Israel, not only in theory but in practice, or at least enough of its high-ranking cabinet members are interested in practice in Palestinians not living here on a mass scale. And
Meaning ethnic cleansing.
Yeah, but I don't want to use that word purposely because I think that word doesn't allow us to have a serious conversation about what a lot of people might think on their own, which is this fantasy that if we play our cards right, we can expel Arabs. And I think that fantasy has heightened post the 7th of October, and I think because of given our actors in government, it also has an ability to manifest itself more than in the past. And in a way, what I'm saying is actually not shocking as well at all, because like senior cabinet members are saying pretty openly that they want to expel Arabs, and I think we need to have a conversation about what that means. In a way, the reason I sort of was hesitant, other than the sort of the cat is using the ethnic cleansing word, is because it doesn't allow us to have a conversation about expulsion as a desire of Israelis, and as a desire of a lot of liberal-minded Israelis as well. And I think this fantasy that we have that they're not here is a really troubling fantasy. And so that's why I was hesitant in answering, because I don't want this to feel like, oh, he says we're ethnic cleansing, but I do think we have a fantasy of expulsion, and we need to have a conversation about it. What do we think about that? What do we think about that when they're not in the room? Can we say that we do want it? Can we say that we don't want it? And how do we, if we don't believe in it, how do we educate or train ourselves morally to say I have an interest in them not leaving, which I think is something that you don't hear enough.
If I might briefly interject, I am curious
Sure.
because part of what's coming to my mind now is at least the structures of what's in my mind I would say is like a frequent debate between liberals and leftists in America or in general, that liberals are often more interested in the conversations and the ideas, whereas leftists are people of action, so to speak, for their beliefs.
Yeah.
And I'm almost wondering that, like, if you're operating in leftist circles, I find it interesting that when you're saying that you see this fantasy of expulsion, the threat of expulsion, and that your instinct is that it's the conversation that you're interested in among Jews, but not necessarily a course of action
No,
against that.
no, there's definitely action against that. The action against that lies in a lot of how we do our very practical politics in this country. So in our case, there is a strong Arab or Palestinian minority, and the question is, do we view? A lot of times, you'll hear by liberals and the left in this country, well, obviously we'd want the Arabs part of government, but it's less legitimate government to do things. That's a very standard argument in Israel. What do you mean it's a less legitimate argument to do things? First of all, that's a problem for us. We should have an interest in having Arabs in coalition or in government, or in some sense we should have an interest in that type of politics. and that's in Israel proper, in Israel citizenship wise. In the question of um, in the question of the West Bank, the question is how are we dealing with Arabs living in Area C? How are we? Is it? Do we view that as a problem? And I think in many senses, government right now, and in some senses, military, viewed as a problem. If we look historically, it's not only something that the right viewed as a problem, it's something that Yigal Allon viewed as a problem. It's something that we need to talk about, not only to have a conversation, but to actually, I'm a practical and pragmatic individual, I'd like to think, and definitely incremental in the sense that what needs to be done tomorrow. Um, and how do we view ourselves in this region? Do we view Arabs as people who we should be partnering with politically, or is it a problem? And it's such a basic thing when you say that it's a problem. When you say ethnic cleansing, it suddenly becomes like this boogeyman. But the reality of it is, for me, that I don't want people living here to not live here. And if I don't want that, then I need to start behaving with them as people that I have political conversations with and not marginalize them. So that's a very practical answer, I hope.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Do you think the state of Israel is part of the final redemption?
No, like not uniquely. I think I'm a very old school traditional Jew in terms of kalu kol hakitzim, and that everything that happened after the destruction of the Second Temple is a part of the redemption. I
The state
think
is uniquely part of that.
I don't think there's a unique thing happening here, but I do think that it could be if we behave the way we should, and if Hashem wants. I think the problem that I have with that dictating of is it's like it's not a dialogue with God anymore. It's like we're telling him what to do. Ultimately, we can do what we try to do, and he decides whether to respond in kind. And I think that's what davening teaches us. And I'm nervous about sort of Israel as a state of redemption turning into a monologue. And actually, and when you turn our relationship with God into a monologue, you're actually making him much less part of your life. You see that very much in Temple Mount and like Har HaBayit, where like the presence of Hashem becomes so less important than our domination. There's no moment where we say, "I grew up in the old city." For me, like going to Har HaBayit is like bemet. It's like the way I was raised in like living across the Kotel was going to Har HaBayit is like like eating on Yom Kippur, like that, because there's things which are beyond what you're allowed to do, or beyond what a Jew can do, and only when there's a response on the other side can something happen. And I think by turning the conversation into a monologue, basically we're marginalizing Hashem in the conversation. I know that's it's definitely a judgmental thing to say. I'm not suggesting that the people who are doing that are less Jewish or less religious than I am, but I think there's a deep flaw in the theology which marginalizes Hashem and turns Hister Panim, or his absence, into something that we're fine with.
Do you think peace between Israelis and Palestinians will happen within your lifetime?
um, I mentioned before that I'm pessimistic in general.
There's some good questions for you coming up.
Okay. I would also say, can I imagine? I'm trying to word something, but it's coming up pessimistic as well. The way I imagine sort of dignity at this point goes through more and more violence first, which is something which is very hard for me to reconcile with, in the sense that I can imagine sort of a different state of affairs where we're out of violence against us and out of our weakness and various different geopolitical calculations, we submit to a different form of governance or the Palestinians, which allow them for dignity. In a sense, it would be great for them to have dignity, but to say that as an Israeli who has my physical reality is here, is not a very is not a very happy thing to say. And that, so in a sense, even when I do imagine sort of peace in what I imagine you articulated, which is like that, that there are two states or something, yeah, something of that nature. I don't know. I can only imagine that at this point going through an immense amount of violence first, and that frightened me very much, and it also makes it very challenging because I'm somebody who's sort of supportive of peace. That being said, like maybe things will happen. Like our job is to do what our job is to do, and I don't know what the world wants for us. So when I analyze, I become very pessimistic, but also like I'm cautious of my very, very limited analysis.
So on that same note, I'm curious, what do you think should happen with Gaza and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict after the war? Although now the war is kind of in an interesting place where it's kind of paused, not really paused.
Well, I think the question is, and definitely in Gaza, is who's a sovereign. And I think when I mentioned way earlier that January, I started being very skeptical about this war. It's because it was very clear that from the government's perspective, there's no interest in having an alternative sovereign. And the minute there's no alternative sovereign, problematic as they may be, then there's no alternative either to Hamas or to never-ending war. So I think the only way to end the war is to have some sort of sovereign on the other side. I think it's a pretty moderate answer, but I think, and if that means the PA, then it's the PA with all its problems and so on. But I don't, I imagine that if we wanted a sovereign on the other side who's not the Hamas, we'd be able to get to somebody. There were parts, I think, in March and April 2024 when they were talking about finding some sort of like coalition of like sheikhs, and these ideas keep on coming up and falling down because it's clear that on the Israeli side, on the governmental side, there's no interest in a real sovereign on the other side, which has always been the problem. That we don't want we want it to be our sovereignty. There's no such thing of lack of sovereignty, lack of world sovereignty, in the context that we live in. So if we're not like in the book of Judges, like it's there's always going to be a sovereign. So if we don't allow for a sovereign, it means that we're the sovereign. What I'd want there to be is to have an actor on the other side who we can engage with. I think there are a lot of options to that, and PA being one of them. But I think for that, we need a government to do it. And it seems to me that it won't be this government. So in order to have any sort of substantial change, you'd probably need a different government. I said before that I'm incremental in my approach to politics. I think the question should be, what's the orientation? Where are we going? The left, the right, of course, but also the left is very critical of sort of Oslo. For a lot of different reasons, but I think there was a brief period where it was out before Rabin was assassinated, mainly in 93, 94, where it could have gone in a lot of different directions. So what does incremental look like? It means that Israelis and Israeli government come to a conclusion that Palestinians need the freedom that we have. And go into a process where they try to move in that direction. And that turned out the way it turns out. But I'd be interested in the country going into that direction.
Where do you identify? These are our last two questions.
That's fine. That's so 17 and 18.
Yeah, basically. Where do you identify on Israel's political and religious spectrum? And do you have friends on the quote-unquote other side?
I would say, where do I identify in the religious spectrum? I would probably call myself like Shomer Torah Mitzvot, which means that I identify within mainstream Orthodox halacha. I don't know. Those questions are so much more complicated than everything you've been asking me now. I would say I'm a halachic Jew. That's where I identify. In Israel, we say Hasmol the movement that I'm a part of. So obviously we identify left, but that obviously means very specific things in Israel. It would mean for me, left means that I'm worried of too much inequality, and that I want a peaceful resolution and an end to occupation. So I need to clarify that in the Israeli context. So identify there. What else did I need to say?
Do you have friends on the quote unquote other side?
Yeah, most of my world is on all other sides. I mean, I send my kids to religious Zionist day schools, so it's It's not. I think the chiddush is that I have friends on my side. It's
Mhm. Well, I'm curious. Like, has that been hard for you? Because I can imagine with all the criticisms of the government, of the war, of the IDF. I know you were also previously the director of Breaking the Silence.
yeah.
Um, how does that fit into the relationships you cultivate, where there's a draft for every Israeli Jew, and the vast majority are, if not right, then center right.
Well, I would say for me that it also it teaches you. I'd like to hope a bit of like humility regarding the importance of politics and also just understanding complexities. I'm saying this again as somebody who's deeply political and deeply critical. So it's not like I'm saying this in order to be less critical, which a lot of times is what happens. But some of the teachers of my kids vote for Ben Gvir. And they wake up every morning thinking, how can my kid be the happiest and healthiest person they can be? And that's really important for me as a life lesson to remember that there are people who can come to very different conclusions, and I can be in very deep opposition to them, and they really care most of the time about making my children happy and educated. So in many senses, I'm very happy that I have the opportunity to be not in my world and not in my bubble all the time. I say this also as this that's true on the religious, but also true on the left. Very much part of liberal left circles in Israel and around the Western world in general is that it tends to be very secularly dominated places, which means that I need to allow myself to be a minority in that sense as well. Sometimes it's incredibly frustrating, but it also teaches you a whole bunch of stuff. And lastly, a lot of my job is with non-Jews, with Palestinians, and learning. I think it's also really this is true about the previous questions as well. You can learn how to love this place so much more and in such different ways when you talk with Palestinians in this country. As a Jew, so learning Tzfat or learning Akko or learning Lod, which I think as examples, which I think is fundamentally significant to somebody who cares about the land, doing that in conversation and in relationship with Palestinians or Hebron is actually really meaningful for me as a Jewish person who loves Israel.
Have
Um,
you lost friends or familiar relationships from your politics?
yes. Hey, we can have short answers as well. yeah,
How
yeah.
have you balanced that or navigated that? And has it ever made you question being so outspoken?
Well, it's always been my choice as well. Um, yeah, sometimes there are irreconcilable differences. I mean, sometimes like I'm a very political individual, and sometimes, and my friends, people who I grew up in yeshiva with, or people I went to high school with, sometimes they come to not only to different conclusions, but to lifestyle or life conclusions, which are in direct opposition and conflict with things that I do, and that obviously creates strains. But I think it's true. Anybody who sort of takes stances. So it's not you pay your price. You're a responsible individual, and things happen. And I think but that's true also for anybody. If somebody's a boss at work and they have employees, some employees are inevitably not going to like them, and it's not going to be solved. And I think it's part of how it has to do with relationships. And some might think that I'm just an annoying or an individual, and I might think that about other people. So the reason I'm sort of like saying, like answering you the way that I'm answering is that I don't feel like in my life perspective, I don't have any sort of like feeling of like outcastness or martyrdom or any of that stuff. And I really try. But I will say for the audiences here, that's a very Jerusalemite Jerusalemite leftists are very specific individuals who very much undersell their minorityness as being something which is sort of like what needs to be discussed. I think because we're constantly being asked, including secular Jerusalemites as well, what's it like to be a minority? You're like, it's not that bad. So I already recognize my instinctive like being from Jerusalem, which I would say is such a major part of my identity as being of this city in my politics as well.
So, our final question, perfect for a pessimist. Do you have more hope or fear for Israel and the Jewish people?
Um, yeah, probably more fear. Not. I mean, um, maybe my way to second answer that question is that I have. Um, uh, I don't think anything is truly solvable in like this world. Um, but and in that sense, it's a very pessimistic answer and fear and so on. I do think that we're very lucky, like Jews of our era are very lucky to have most of them, not all Jews, but many Jews in our era are very lucky and privileged and fortunate to have the freedom we have to deal with these questions in the sort of the nature that we're dealing with them, and that creates, I wouldn't say necessarily hope, but a sense of responsibility and a sense of calmness, which we need to be say thank you for. I'm very aware that I don't have romantic notions about sort of like how great it was to have no power. It creates a different set of challenges, and those challenges are sometimes very hard, and sometimes one can be pessimistic about the outcomes of that. But the fact that I can wake up in the morning and do this kind of thing for a living is actually quite incredible. You don't need a deep understanding of Jewish history to know that's not always the case. And the fact that I can do it with the relative comfort that I'm doing it is for me very exciting and moving. I don't know if that's hopeful or pessimistic,
No, it's very
but it's
helpful.
definitely
But it's
where I
helpful.
am.
But it's
But it's
helpful.
helpful. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for answering 18
Thank you.
questions. How was this for you?
This was actually really interesting. I'm like, do I really think that? Do I not think that? I don't know. I need to go back and listen and sort of re-articulate for myself. But
Okay,
thanks.
awesome. We'll send you the link.
Thank you very much.